There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shaun of the newly renamed channel, Shaun Breathes Books. And this is another episode of Zooming In, which is an occasional series where I talk about bookish topics, bouncing off some kind of a bookish article online with, let's see how many times I can get bookish into one sentence, with bookish social media luminaries the world over. And what a delight to welcome for his umpteenth appearance on my channel, but his first on this series, Dorian Stuber, joining us from Little Rock, and the occasional and recently very prodigious author of a wonderful book blog, which I can't pronounce the name of, so that's how we'll get started, Dorian. Welcome, and tell us the name of your blog.
Thanks, Shaun. I should have chosen a better name. It's really true. I've thought it many times. You can read why it has that name on my blog. The blog is called Eiger, München, Jungfrau. Those are 3 mountains in Switzerland. There are mountains of books in my house. So I'm happy to be here as always. Thanks for the invite.
That's wonderful. So we're here to talk about an article with an intriguing topic. It appeared in the New York Times in January. 2 novels about what's their name by Leah Greenblatt, and the subtitle gives us a little bit more to go on. Not all books tell readers what to call the main character. An editor, that would be Leah Greenblatt, recommends 2 that don't. So, get us started. What did you think of this article and the topic of unnamed main characters and or narrators in fiction, Dorian?
Well, now I'm feeling really bad because I don't even know if I read the article, or if I did, I've forgotten what it says. But I chose the topic. I chose the topic because I think it is a really, I think it's a fascinating topic for sure. I'm curious what the books are that she mentioned. Maybe that will jog my memory whether I read that or not.
It'd be easy to forget what she said because she didn't really say very much. The first half of this very short article was about her choosing a new name for herself, which really was kind of off topic, I thought. The 2 novels are Milkman by Anna Burns, which I have read, and Remainder by Tom McCarthy, which I have not.
Okay, yeah, I've not read that either. But a few thoughts that occur to me are, I'm guessing there is a kind of connection to the history of literary realism here. Like, I'm thinking back to like 18th century, 19th century beginnings of the novel as a form in particular, because I think it is pretty novelistic. Like, this is different from like the speaker eye of a poem, I would say, right? Because it's a character in some way, right? But we know things about them, but we don't know their name. And in that early period of the novel, you would get a lot of times where writers would not use like names like of places or people, like, like when the coach pulled into the inn in the little town of N in 18
long dash.
Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, and so like that was a kind of like gesture towards like this idea that like this text is so much of our world that if we actually like named it, then it would be like we might be liable for slander or something like that. You know what I mean? And so I feel like it's a kind of like offshoot. It has something to do with realism, I suspect. The next thought I had was that it seemed to me there were 2 kinds of like forms that this unnamed I could take. There's probably others. The 2 that came to mind were when there is a framed narration and there's someone who's maybe not super important to the story, but is like the vehicle by which the story then gets told. Yes. So I was thinking about Heart of Darkness, Conrad's Heart of Darkness in this regard, which is like, everyone thinks it's like, oh, it's narrated by Marlowe, first person, but actually like there's another dude who starts things off and is like, says, I heard this Marlowe guy one night, and then Marlowe launches into this whole first person narration, right? And who that first I is other than like an associate of Marlowe's, we never know, right? So and you see it a lot too in like 19th century German novel. I think Hoffmann uses this technique a lot, like people who find they find a letter or they find something or whatever, and then they're sharing that, right? So that's a kind of subset, one version of that I. And then the other version, which I think is the most interesting to me, is where you have like a main character, first person narration, main character, but we don't know the person's name. Right? And so the example that I immediately always think of is Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca.
Yes.
Right? It's very easy for us to think that a book called Rebecca with a first person narrator, Rebecca must be the one telling the story, and that is not. We only ever know this character as the second Mrs. De Winter, right? So in that case in particular, and I think the other examples that occurred to me, the author has chosen not to name this character, presumably, or whether they've chosen it for this reason or not, it has the effect of like forcing us to think about that character's sort of lack of identity or absence of identity, and texts that kind of really make much of that, right? So again, in Rebecca, right, like where how dominant that the first wife, how Rebecca was and continues to be, the overshadowing of the narrator, who is young, who is uncertain, who is pushed around, and maybe things change by the end of the novel, but that's super important to her character, right? And so the lack of the name, it seems really fitting. So just four more examples of text that I thought of with this, and then I want to hear what you have to say, Shaun. So The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, right? And again, this is about a female character who is ill physically, maybe psychologically, but is certainly being made ill by the treatment of her husband and her male doctor. And so again, the lack of a name there seems pretty symptomatic, seems pretty telling. Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, right? Where again, a kind of chameleon type figure, everybody is always projecting their thoughts onto this character, and the character is also shape-shifting, and he for a while he takes up the communist cause, and then he black radicalism and the upwardly mobile black kind of self education in the Booker T. Washington vein, sort of that malleability of his character from within himself, and then how others perceive him seems important. That character does not have a name. Marlen Haushofer's 1970s novel, The Wall, which is a great, wonderful novel, kind of like a weird sort of apocalyptic novel. As a woman goes to visit some friends in the countryside in Austria, and wakes up one day and everybody's gone. She's the only person left in the world, right? Again, the lack of name seems fitting there. And finally, maybe the biggest example of all would be Proust, where it's very common for readers or critics to call the first person narrator Marcel, because it seems to track in many ways closely to Proust's life. And Proust, on a couple of occasions in those 7 volumes, sort of says, something weird, something about the author, this character, who may share the name with the author or something, but there is actually no name for that character, right? I'm not sure exactly. There's a lot more to be made of why not there, but in all cases, kind of a question of struggle for identity. And it seems really interesting to me that readers really often want to put a name to a character. So the fact that we often will call that character Marcel, or that the confusion with Rebecca, for example, it's partly because we like to have characters that are named, I think. So it's kind of there's something
hardwired.
Yeah, maybe, right? Maybe we want identity to be defined in ways that these texts are always kind of pushing us against. But so those were my initial thoughts. Does any of that resonate for you, Shaun? You shared something with me before we started, so I'm hoping you're going to say that now.
Absolutely. I found what you said fascinating, and I think we're going to call this video Dorian Schooled Shaun on blah, 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 because I had to say, as I was preparing for this interview, I was searching my mind for any reaction to this topic, and I had to realize that I rarely notice if a character isn't named. And when I do notice, it's because I'm going to talk about it on my Friday reads, and I think, okay, what's the character's name? Oh, they're not named. I literally don't notice. So it doesn't have that effect on me. I can see what you're saying, and I think I should be paying more attention from now on to this topic, but it really doesn't have much meaning. I struggle to follow characters' names, so I think the absence of a name actually helps me.
Okay, because I was going to ask you. Yeah, I was going to ask if you had thoughts about what that's about. I mean, I don't think there's any should about it, but to me, it's fascinating that this is something that it sort of doesn't register for you in a way, right? For me, it's always I noticed it very quickly, and so you sort of make sense of that by the general struggle you have with kind of characters and names, or
well,
what?
I only have a struggle if there's too many characters for me to keep track of. But I will always remember the name of the protagonist in Shuggy Bain because it's in the name, or David Copperfield. But give me any other novel that I've read and loved, and I will be hard pressed to pull that name out. So the names don't stick with me in general. So it doesn't affect me. But what you have said is really interesting, and it resonates with some of the stuff I found in other essays and articles. Do you know Sam Sachs?
Yeah, I do. I do. So. He's a wonderful guy. Yeah. Head book guy for the Wall Street Journal. Yeah,
that's right. Well, he wrote an article in the New Yorker back in 2015, "The Rise of the Nameless Narrator," and he had a lot of interesting things to say that will resonate, or that I want to bounce off you, rather than try and analyze my psyche about this topic. So he traces it back to allegory. the everyman figure, and that
Yeah,
makes
okay.
sense. And
Right.
he also says when modern writers want to locate their story outside of time, having a nameless narrator helps create that aura, that that
Mm,
that feeling. He talks about Proust. Not only him, but other articles I read talk about how the absence of a character's name or a narrator's name fits in with autofiction,
right.
which you could conceive of Proust, Remembrance of
Yeah.
Things Past, as
Yeah.
autofiction.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But I also think that a lot of autofiction, it's the author's name is the main
Yeah.
character, but I guess some of them
Yeah.
also just don't use a character's name.
No, they don't, but I think there's a very strong tendency there that we do say that like that's the writer. I just think Rachel Cusk or Knausgaard or something like that's Rachel Cusk or that's a version of. I mean, maybe it's obviously some version of them, but we don't think like, oh, it's just some person. They there's not actual human attached to that in some way, and I don't know. I hadn't thought about this before, but in response to what you're saying and thinking, Sam's point about allegory is really interesting. I keep getting stuck on realism and the aftershoots of realism, and the critic Roland Barthes' wonderful book SZ, which from the 70s, which I can, because we're both Canadians here, where I can pronounce correctly and you'll understand it. My American students are always like, I refuse to call it SZ. It's ridiculous. So SZ, it's a weird kind of title. But what he did is with a class, he spent an entire year working on this one Balzac story called Sarrazine. And it's a remarkable book because he goes through and he kind of like tears it apart and like sort of like looks for the different kinds of basic structures that are involved in creating a realist text. And one of them, he talks about this way in which we don't have a sense of like how important name is for our sense of character. Like all the different kind of semantic attributes that we connect with a character, like maybe this person is like they're wealthy or they are grasping or conniving or strongly masculine or feminine or any number of things that we could imagine, right? Like he thinks of it as a kind of constellation of these attributes, and that gets solidified in terms of the idea of a character, but a name really helps do that for us. He has a really interesting little riff on like how peculiar it is to have historical people in like real fiction, like Napoleon or something like that, right? And he for Bart, he's like it should only ever be a minor character. It's ridiculous to have a whole novel from the perspective of Napoleon or something because we already like, it's sort of like embarrassing in a way because it's sort of like there's some weird usurpation of the actual person and character going on there. Now, obviously, not every writer agrees with that. We have books like that, but it's true. I think that often that you'll have if you have an important historical character in a novel, it's like some made up minor person around them who is the central figure, you know what I mean? And like someone in the court of Napoleon or whatever or something like that who casts light on him or whatever. But this is all going back to his idea about like how naming and again that speaks to that realist writer's sense that names are so important that like you can't even give a full name because it's like you would be speaking about something as that had really happened in some
Yeah,
way. So
libelous or whatever. Yep.
yeah.
Another point Sam Sachs makes is, and I didn't note down any examples he gave, but that namelessness, he says, has become an increasingly familiar trait in the fiction of exile. Does that ring any bells
Mm,
for you?
interesting. I mean, I'm not thinking of specific. I mean, this isn't really exile. I'm immediately thinking Kafka when I think of like exile or alienation or something like that, and all those like either nameless or initialed different versions of K or whatever, right? Joseph K. We get at one point, but I don't know that there are any texts by Kafka where we have a full name and last name. I don't know, and rarely a first name, right? But he's probably thinking more of like people, writers who have specifically like who themselves have lived through exile or who have characters who are undergoing that experience. And again, I'm blanking on that right now, but it
Yeah,
kind of makes sense in a way of like just as I was talking before about like how some of these texts where like there's a kind of the character has a sort of struggle with identity, like the yellow wallpaper protagonist, for example. We can imagine characters who are like caught up in vast bureaucracies, who have been claiming asylum somewhere and who like are caught in like some kind of legal limbo or whatever. Like a nameless character in that sense would be very fitting, maybe. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And it makes me think of just that quite a common experience of an immigrant is that they
Yeah.
choose a new name.
Right.
In the old days,
Right.
they would be given a new surname that was pronounceable in America or whatever, but even in modern times, choose a pronounceable first name that they would use. So it
Right.
would make sense that that would come up in the fiction, or that the name
Yeah.
of the main character would be
Yeah.
something to explore.
Yeah. Right. And something that sometimes is chosen and sometimes is forced. And I'm thinking about like indigenous people too, often where there's often kind of
Absolutely.
sense of being forced, right? This is definitely a kind of like analogous kind of, or a strand of thought that's like not exactly the same as where we started, but is definitely parallel in some way, right? Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to read a longer section from him and see what you make of it. He writes, "Consider the Bible one of the earliest textual cases to deal with the conundrum of naming. In much of it, God is identified by what theologians call the tetragrammaton, four letters that cannot be spoken. Because the word lacks vowels, no one really knows how it should be pronounced, and must be substituted with generic placeholders. If God had a commonplace proper name, he would merely be distinguished from other deities. Being the one true God, his name is sacred and unutterable."
Mm-hmm. For sure. That's profoundly important in the Jewish tradition in particular. And I mean, I think it's sort of important in the Christian tradition, but less so, right? Because then, then the story with Jesus, like it kind of changes things. And then it's like that move towards something that is partly human and partly not. And it isn't common, for example, for Orthodox Jews to even the word God, which is then like a place, as you say, is kind of like is a signifier with a line through it, is like kind of placeholder in a way,
Yeah.
right? Even the word God, it would for Orthodox Jews, is often, if you write it, you write G-D, because like it's like to represent this indirect representation, right? Is sort of like is it's sort of considered improper or impossible in a way. So if God's name is like, Shmuel or something, right? Like this is like completely different than, right? I mean, like this is something that distinguishes the human from the from something other than human, which again makes me come back to this idea of like how much struggle there seems to be in a lot of these cases where the characters are not named on yellow wallpaper, where they like are not fully recognized as human. Her husband and her doctor are not, they're not recognizing her that way, right? So to have a name seems really important in terms of one's human being. I work on Holocaust literature. It is, everybody knows this, right? That one of the things that happened in the camps almost right away is that people's names were taken away from them and they were replaced by a number, or maybe not even that in a smaller kind of camp. But like, and even before the war started, one of the things that happened in 1930s Germany under the Nuremberg laws is that all Jews' names middle names were changed. I think in 1938, like men were forced to take the middle name Israel, and women were forced to take the middle name Sarah, right? Sarah. So, that sense of like who kind of controls a name and who doesn't get a name is pretty important to our sense of like who is a human being.
So this is a question that's just occurred to me as you've been talking about this. Is there a way that unnamed narrators or main characters, is there a specifically Jewish tradition within Jewish literature that
Mm.
you could talk about? I'm not aware of one, but if anybody would be, you would be.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know. I don't think so. I mean,
Yeah.
again, I think like the prohibition for Jews is with the name of God, right? That and to name humans is really important. And I mean, again, I think it's the opposite how important it is to name. I mean, I think about the way in which, like, and I'm sure there are many other traditions, spiritual, religious, what have you, that do this, but that like, it is said that everyone dies twice, right? Once when they die sort of like physiologically, they take their last breath, but then they die kind of really when no one remembers their name anymore. Like every week in shul, we say Kaddish for the prayer of mourning for people in the congregation who died on that day, and like most of the time nobody knows who the heck these people are anymore. Right, I mean, a long time ago, but it's important that we say it because they keep alive in some particular way, right? Losing the name, losing no one knowing your name, is when you kind of fully vanish as a person.
Now I'm fascinated to find out what a novel by a Jewish writer or with Jewish characters, if they have an unnamed main character or narrator, how or if
Yeah.
that operates differently within the text. That's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
curious.
Yeah. It would be really interesting. Maybe some of your viewers can chime in comments and like
Yeah.
give us some
Yeah.
examples. Because I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I wonder if there are. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So maybe my last question, or at least one of my last questions for you is there an extra level of enjoyment for you as a reader when the main character or narrator is unnamed? Like, is it something you
Hmm.
seek out?
Hmm.
Something that you enjoy
No,
in a special
no, I
way?
wouldn't say. I mean, I wouldn't say seek it out, no, but I also, it doesn't, I'm always kind of interested in that. And sometimes it happens to me in the same way it happens to you, of like, I have to sort of,
Yeah.
write about this person or something like that. Or if I'm preparing to teach this text, I'm like, wait a minute, although usually I feel like I kind of notice it because I do think, I was going to ask you this before, like when you were talking about like the kind of struggle with names or whatever, like it made me wonder if maybe I read for character more than say you do or something. Like I feel like,
No, no, I'm very much of a
no.
character reader, but the name itself
Hmm.
is not the important part of the
So
character.
interesting. That's
Yeah.
really interesting because I think of that name is so important to, and there are many characters' names where like the name itself is sort of telling us something about them or indicating or alluding to something else. Another example we might have talked about is Moby-Dick, right? Like, call me Ishmael. Like, that's one way to read that is that's not actually his name, right? He's like asking us to call him that, and then that makes us think about a certain lineage, going back to the Bible, et cetera, et cetera. We may not, in fact, kind of like know his name. I don't know. I guess I do. When I read the text that has a kind of nameless narrator, then I'm interested in that, but it's never something that I'm like, oh, I'm looking for a book like for that, or hoping for a book like that, or something like that.
So yeah, I do struggle with, and we're not going to broaden the discussion. We're done here, but just a couple things about characters' names. Well, years ago, I read a Swedish novel, translated obviously, "The Family Clause" by Jonas Hassen Khemiri, a Tunisian Swedish novelist, and I really enjoyed it. But it did get a little bit annoying. He never named any of his characters, and it was a big extended family, and every character was named that way. For example, a daughter who is a sister who is no longer living. That
Hmm,
would be instead in place of the name. A girlfriend who
interesting.
is a mother who works as a lawyer. So that's how he named his characters. And at first I was intrigued by it. By the end, it was a bit much, but it was
Right.
a lot easier to follow who the characters were for me.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting.
Well, Dorian, this was a great discussion, and I got through the whole thing without dropping the word onomastics on you.
And yes, but now everybody's going to go look that up. The
Yeah,
other thing that I didn't talk about, or you didn't talk about, is like our own names. I often have the experience because I have sort of an unusual name where, like, if I'm, spelling it for someone or whatever, like they're either like, "Oh, that's a weird name," or "Oh, Oscar, like, picture Dorian Gray." Like, I have a weird sort of like literary connection there in my
you
name.
do? Well, maybe next time you're on my channel, you'll take us up into the attic and show us the picture.
I can't even believe how rough it's looking. Oh, it's the horrible.
Well, something
10
like that's got to be going on. You haven't
Hurt your
you
eyes, people. Yeah,
you're
yeah.
looking younger
Like
every
to
time I
have
talk to you.
this, you can just imagine what the picture looks like. Yeah, yeah.
And my name is Shaun, obviously, and I'm adopted, so I was born legally with another name. And I
Ah.
don't know, I don't think that's affecting how I experience names in fiction, but I might have a think about that. Talk to my
Yeah,
analyst.
I feel like maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I
Interesting.
was named Shaun when I was adopted at the age of 4 months, so I don't think it's
Right,
probably a
right,
thing, but
right.
it's interesting to
Do
think
you
about.
do you know your birth parents' names? Are you
I
interested in that? Not.
absolutely, I was deeply interested in that in my 20s and 30s, and so I did all that tracing and reuniting and stuff. Now it feels I've kind of naturalized it. I don't think of it hardly at all, but
Huh,
occasionally I catch myself thinking about who I might be if I was Mark William Smith. That was my birth name.
huh.
So, and I'll edit this
Yeah.
out, I'm sure, but Dorian is the surname of one of my great aunts. She married a man whose name was Mr. I don't remember his first name, but Dorian.
No kidding. I've never heard of
Yeah.
that as the last name. That's so
No, I
interesting. Huh.
don't think I had either.
I feel like you got a much more interesting name than the birth name. I mean, no offense or anything, but I
No,
think
well,
that
the only
is
thing
a lot
interesting
richer.
about Mark William Smith was Mark was with a C, and that I think that's kind of cool.
Okay. French. Yeah.
Anyway, Dorian, thank you for the chat. I hope you'll come back.
Anytime, you know it, man. I love the channel, love to chat. I had this is not something I'd ever thought about before, so you gave me an opportunity to think about it, and I'm grateful for that. So I
Well,
hope
and you
you're
have given me a lot to think about that I think is going to be transformative in how I read my next book or two.
awesome. Good,
Thinking
good
about
stuff.
thinking about the names. Thanks so much,
Names.
Dorian.
All right, you bet. Thanks, John.